Great. Let me get sync. Sweet. Welcome to the Monkey Dance Podcast. This is Ohan, and our co-host today is Pelin.
Pelin Kasar.
And she's returning, I think, multiple times, maybe the third or fourth time.
Yeah.
And our guest today is Camilo.
Yes, Camilo Martinez.
And we're going to start out with just a brief reminder of Pelin telling us about what she works on.
Yeah, I'm a PhD candidate here at CEU, and I'm working on implicit bias, responsibility, and recently responsibility in AI context.
Right on. And I remember the most recent episode is episode 28, so you can catch Pelin on that, but I'll put the links in the show notes as well. But I guess we'll throw it to Camilo. Why don't you tell us who you are and what you do?
Sure. Thanks for the invitation to the podcast. Yeah, so I'm a postdoctoral researcher here at CEU. I'm affiliated with the philosophy department, but I also belong to this big project called the Knowledge in Crisis Project. This is funded by the Austrian Science Fund. And I'm a philosopher. I work mostly on two main areas. One is social political philosophy, and the other is the philosophy of mind and action. So in social and political philosophy, I'm interested in social norms. So by social norms, I mean these like informal rules of social interaction that are shared by people in a social group. And in the philosophy of mind and action, I'm interested in psychological coherence. So what does it mean for a psychology, a system of psychological attitudes to be coherent? And under what conditions is coherence something that's rational? And under what conditions is incoherence irrational?
Do you want to maybe start out with explaining your work specifically on coherence?
Yeah, sure. So as I just said, like the big question in my work on coherence is, I guess it's two questions. So one question is, what's the nature of coherence? So let's start with like a simple observation. It seems to be the case that in some combinations of psychological attitudes are what we would sort of like pre-theoretically call incoherent. So let's say that you believe both that Pelin is here and that Pelin is not here. So you believe P and also believe not P. That seems to be bad. That seems to be incoherent. This applies to attitudes beyond belief. So for instance, suppose you have the plan to buy some shoes. You have the belief that the only way in which you're going to get the shoes is by going to the mall. But you also have the intention of never going to the mall. Right? So that's also a combination of states that seems incoherent. So one question I pursue is, well, what exactly does it mean to say that a combination of psychological states is incoherent? And then the second big question I pursue in connection to coherence is, well, it seems that there's something bad with your psychology when you have combinations of psychological states that are incoherent. And the sort of like badness that seems to be displayed by you is a kind of rational failure. So we seem to think that people who are incoherent are not fully rational. They're not rationally as they ought to be. So the question is, what exactly makes it irrational to be incoherent? And under what conditions is it rational to have a coherent psychology?
And so when you talk about rationality in this sense, you're talking about rationality contained within the individual, not necessarily rationality with the individual in relation to society.
Yeah, that is correct. So the focus of this literature is mostly an individual agent. So the agent is the sort of like locus of belief, of intention, of plans, of hopes. And then we're trying to see under what conditions the different states that, psychological states, mental states that the agent has are fit well with each other, and under what conditions they don't fit well with each other. I guess technically you could like define some sort of notion of like interpersonal coherence, but the literature as it has been sort of like going is mostly focused on the individual case. That's right.
So when you say psychological beliefs, you basically clarified this, but we're talking about two different beliefs, but also two different dispositions, two different attitudes towards a person or a thing. So any of these types of states, as long as they're not coherent with one another, then you might argue that there's rationality there.
Yeah, exactly. So sort of like the traditional focus of this literature is on what people call intentional attitudes. So these are attitudes that are taken towards propositions that have some sort of propositional content. So belief is a clear example of an attitude of that sort. When I believe that Pelin is there, that belief has some sort of content, right? The proposition that Pelin is there. Other states that also have this sort of content and are in that sense intentional are, plans, intentions. Some people think that desires are also like this. It gets trickier when you're dealing with attitudes that are not really of this sort. So if you're dealing with stuff like pains, if you're dealing with stuff like pleasure, if you're dealing with stuff like dispositions, then it seems less clear that those things can really be incoherent. So the pain that I'm feeling in my toes is not incoherent with the pain I'm feeling in my hand. It seems to be a category mistake to think that those things could, in principle, be either coherent or incoherent. So most people who work on coherence sort of focus on a specific kind of mental states, which are intentional in the sense that they have some sort of content, yes.
Just to clarify, when we talk about incoherence, like we are looking at the beliefs, like what those agents are saying that they believe, or can we just, for example, compare their beliefs with what they do? Like, because since I'm working on implicit bias, most of the time, like we are talking about cases when someone says P, but their action, we are looking at the action, and that suggests not P.
Not
but
P,
yeah, we are not really talking about their belief. We are somehow inferring their belief from their action.
Yeah, that's a fascinating question, and that connects to something that I've been thinking on recently, which is fragmentation, mental fragmentation, which is this idea that our minds might not be as unified as we think they are. But briefly, the focus of the philosophical work on coherence I engage with is on the contents of your mind. So we look at your mind independently of the consequences of holding certain states for action. And we see under what conditions those contents are coherent or incoherent. But definitely when someone declares that they believe something and at the same time act in a way that defies that belief, then that's a problem, and it's a problem for interpretation. So it's a problem for what sort of mental state do you really attribute to the agent? Is it, do you go by the words, the sort of like explicit verbal expression of the belief? Do you go by the actions, right? So if I say I'm an atheist, but I start praying every time I board a plane, am I really an atheist or not? So those cases are going to be tricky, but I guess the literature has concentrated on the question on just what's inside the mind, to put it in some sort of way, yeah.
Okay.
So with fragmentation, it's interesting because if we start to formalize some kind of decision tree of beliefs, then we can get fragmentation, something like isolating subgroups, subsets of beliefs.
Right.
But then if you start looking at something like a probabilistic framework of mind,
yeah,
right, then you can start saying, we don't need to think about it as whether or not the mind is unified. We can look at the mind as a series of probabilistic outcomes, right, with relation to information. So you don't need to necessarily think about the lack of unification of the mind because of the fragmentation of subsets of beliefs. But you can say there's just one system, but that everything is held probabilistically, and that the output of the system, of the agent, of the person, is contingent upon the other beliefs that are called up in a context. So here I have the probability that I will pray is only given what I perceive as the likelihood of a negative outcome, which prayer might help with. But in other situations, I still maintain my atheism. So now my atheism is not a probability of 1. It's a probability of 0.8 contingent upon the context I find myself in. Does that track for how you might see it?
Yeah, that tracks. So I have like some reactions to that. So one reaction is sort of like I would like to clarify exactly what it means to sort of model the mind probabilistically. So there's a tradition in formal epistemology where you can think of doxastic attitudes in terms of what's called outright belief, right? So these are not states that are kind of like on and off. So you either believe or not believe, right? They're like what people call credences. And credences encode some sort of like degree of confidence that is often modeled probabilistically, right? But a lot of people do think that there are coherence relations between credences, right? So if you give credence 0.7 to P, then you ought to give credence 0.3 to not P. So even people who think that the mind is really probabilistic in that way are gonna think that there are still some sort of relations of coherence between the different probabilities. But then you also said something which was, I think, consistent with the idea of fragmentation, and it's the idea that these probabilities are sort of associated with specific contexts. And I think that's the crucial idea in the fragmentation sort of hypothesis. So it's the idea that if you want to characterize what people believe, you don't only look at like the propositions that they believe, but the sort of like elicitation conditions, the contexts where they're going to draw on that information to act, to reason, to think in different sorts of ways. So I think like the second thing you said there is very consistent with this idea of fragmentation, even if we model beliefs in a probabilistic way instead of a sort of like all or nothing way.
Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense, especially when we come back to something. So with the last part you said, if we bring that into, 0.7 probability of P, 0.3 of not P, that we don't necessarily need to have an equal, they don't need to sum up to 1 necessarily if their contexts necessitate that maybe there's a bit more variability there.
Okay, interesting.
So I think that once we start looking at the model hierarchically, we start looking at the context that every belief is maintained in, maybe somehow P and not P don't necessarily need to sum up to 1.
Got it. Okay. So that would be an explanation of fragmentation without incoherence.
Yep.
Sorry, of incoherence without fragmentation. Got it.
Exactly.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah. So I think that view is not common in philosophy. Philosophers will want to appeal to fragmentation as an explanation of incoherence, even for these kinds of like partial gradable states like credences. So
that makes sense.
Yeah, good.
Can you? Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I just want to understand more about this idea of fragmentation because
Sure.
Are we really talking about like brain fragmented, really like in physical terms, or like is it just a metaphor we are talking about, or like should we understand that like it's fragmented in a way that really the contents of our beliefs are not even interacting each other? They're just one is somewhere in my else and one is other, so they are doing other things, but they do not come together. I don't know.
Yeah, and it's kind of science fictional a little bit when you speak of fragmentation. No, it's the idea that it evokes this idea of a fragmented mind as like a different compartments to the brain. Yeah. So I think like people who work on fragmentation actually disagree amongst each other about like how to best understand the idea of fragmentation. But let's say that there's 2 main views. So one view is the idea that when we speak of belief fragments or mental fragments in general, what we mean is sort of like a functional characterization. So we're saying, the agent is disposed in certain ways where it's kind of like useful or profitable from the point of view of interpreting the agent to sort of assign one belief in one context and assign or attribute another belief in a different context. And that's purely functional, right? So there's not commitment there to, any picture where you have like a belief box in your mind, and then there's some sentences in that belief box, and really you have like different, boxes, and those are the different fragments, right? So that's, on that picture, there's no commitment to that, right? Okay. Other people are a bit more, have a bit more of a realist take on what it means to be fragmented, and are gonna think, this really corresponds to different sort of like more robustly understood fragments. So one difference between these 2 interpretations is that, for instance, on the purely functional interpretation, you're going to be forced to assign fragmentation only in cases of incoherence, because it's only in cases of incoherence that you're going to have a reason to attribute different beliefs. But people who like the more robust, the more what I'm calling realist interpretation, are going to think something like, no, you can have coherence in between the fragments, but there could still be different fragments. It could still be that you have one belief over here and one token of like a mental representation with the content P here, and then another belief over here that has the same content. They're in different fragments, but they're consistent.
But how do you know that they're in different fragments if they are consistent?
Right. So the people who like this sort of view appeal to a lot of evidence from cognitive science. That sort of like sort of like indicates that that's in fact how the mind is structured. I'm blanking right now on like some characteristic studies, but there's some like recall studies. I hope I can get them right. But basically the idea is what those the upshot of those studies is it shows that you have the same representation stored multiple times in your mind. And it's consistent, right? So it's, it's P, 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 P. It just happens to be different fragments that are engaged with each representation of P. So yeah, I guess the question ultimately depends on how you think about fragmentation.
Yeah. But it's related to memory studies. That's how I understand, right? Like, because we start talking about beliefs and the cognitive science, like literature or like what you referred, seemed to me or like more about recalling memories. Or I mean, there's some connection between, of course, beliefs and memories. But
yeah, definitely. There's some connection with studies having to do with recall and memory. Mm-hmm. I myself are more inclined to the functionalist understanding of fragmentation. But the people who like the other, like more realist or robust way of understanding fragmentation, are people like Eric Mandelbaum. So he has a paper in a recent volume, and there he sort of like goes over all the evidence from cognitive science, sort of supporting the idea that our mind has to be fragmented.
Yeah, that's actually in the Cognitive Science of Beliefs handbook. Right. Right. Yeah. I mean, the Mandelbaum, the fragmentation idea is quite enticing, especially if we're trying to understand how to formalize a description of beliefs where we can actually look at the beliefs as such. And I think that the more you speak, the more it seems like the way that we describe beliefs is going to be contingent upon how we're using that definition of beliefs. So if I want to treat beliefs as propositions, then it might be easier to deal with fragmentation. But if I'm dealing with beliefs as output, I think that's why more and more cognitive scientists are looking at predictive models, because we put something to an agent and we look at the output of the agent, and then we're like, okay, can we infer what the belief is, what the prior is that the system maintains, given the output? What is the space of hypotheses they entertain, and then what is the likely outcome? And then can we shift the context slightly and get a different outcome?
Got it.
Right? Because then that means that there's a bit more nuance, and it's not always PPP, but P of 7 given XYZ. Right.
Right. Yeah. Okay. That's super interesting. I'm understanding more like these models that you sort of like have in mind. Yeah. Cool.
So when you are making the argument with relation with how fragmentation and coherence come together, what is the crux of your thesis?
Right. So this is in a recent paper that just came out in Thought, but there my interest in my main sort of interest was like to put together two literatures. One is this sort of like literature in what we could call like metaethics, about the normativity of rationality. So the question of why is incoherence irrational and why is coherence rational? And then this whole literature in philosophy of mind, but also in cognitive science, having to do with fragmentation, right? So there, basically, what the main point of that paper is to sort of show that if you take seriously the idea of fragmentation, the idea that this is at least one sort of like really compelling explanation for why sometimes we're incoherent, then that's going to constrain some of the views in this other literature. Some of the views about the question of why is incoherence irrational. And the view it's going to like speak against is a view that is, has been really popular in the last few years. And this is the idea that you can explain all that's bad about incoherence in terms of failures to respond to reasons. So philosophers normally distinguish between two sort of like dimensions or meanings of what it is to be rational. So one is this idea of coherence, which we've been talking about. But there's another idea which is also kind of very plausible, which is the idea that, well, part of what it means to be rational is to respond correctly to your reasons, to respond appropriately to your reasons to have, right? So this has like practical versions. So, if you have like a plan to smoke that, provided that you have the right sort of information, might seem really irrational in light of the reasons you have not to smoke. It also applies to beliefs. So, beliefs are supposed to be grounded in your evidence. So your evidence is what gives you the reasons and what makes your beliefs reasonable or unreasonable, right? So a lot of people in the literature on rationality have tried to conduct a sort of reduction of one kind of rationality to the other. So they have tried to explain what's wrong about being coherent in terms of failures to respond to reasons. And here's more or less how the arguments go. So let's go back to the example of like you believing that Pelin is here and that she's not here. Well, it seems like if your evidence support that Pelin is here, then that same evidence is going to support that it's going to speak against the belief that she's not here. So if you have both beliefs, at least one of those beliefs is going to be unreasonable given the evidence. So this is what it's called in the literature the guarantee hypothesis. It's the idea that whenever you're incoherent, then you have one mental state at least that's guaranteed to be a failure to respond to your reasons. So now the argument I make in that paper is saying, well, that's not so easy if indeed we are fragmented. Because if indeed we are fragmented, then the evidence we have, the information we have, is going to be fragmented as well. And then that could mean that you're incoherent, but each of the beliefs you have, relative to the fragment it belongs to, is a reasonable response to the evidence that's present in that fragment. So that's kind of the connection I'm trying to forge in that paper. So try to bring... So what strikes me as interesting is that philosophers working on the rationality of coherence sort of like make these like claims about the normative significance of incoherence and rationality, but they don't really sort of like ask themselves, how is incoherence psychologically possible to begin with, you know? But once we start like sort of like taking seriously that question and asking ourselves, well, what's really going on inside someone's mind when they're incoherent? Then that's going to like sort of like illuminate this other debate that has been going for a while now.
Yeah. So when it comes to something like smoking, you can have a situation where somebody might deny the evidence. So when we're talking about irrationality or incoherence, somebody who is behaving normatively in what we might describe as incoherent, they might internally be behaving in a coherent sense because they don't necessarily believe the evidence that you're putting in front of them.
Good.
And so you get this kind of conflict.
Yes, definitely. So just to see if I get the case clearly. So you have all these reasons not to smoke, but you fail to appreciate that they're reasons not to smoke.
Yes, and I suppose there are two flavors of that. One is where you can discount the likelihood that you will, say, get cancer. People think that they're never going to get in a car accident, this type of thing. Or you can say, well, the medical establishment is corrupt. Smoking's actually good for me. Right. They just don't want me to feel better, right? So you can have these two flavors of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So people who like the view that this kind of case can be explained as a failure to respond to reasons have some moves up their sleeve. So they could appeal for the last thing you said. They might say something like, well, but just as you have like evidence, you also have higher order evidence. And higher order evidence is evidence about what's the evidence. So I think a lot of cases of, the sort of like the medical establishment is corrupt and so on can be explained as cases where people have good higher order evidence that some first order evidence is not to be trusted, right? So they might belong to some sort of like echo chamber where they get this like sort of like, you could say like good evidence that some sources of information are not reliable sources of information. Therefore, we have to discount whatever evidence comes from them, right? So that would be a way of accommodating that sort of case within the framework. But I take it that you're pushing a deeper point here, which is like, no, it seems like sometimes like our very capacity to respond to reasons is kind of predicated upon our capacity of being coherent. And yeah, so a lot of people who like the view that rationality is about responding to reasons sort of like have a sort of like, they assume that reasons are sort of basic, that you cannot analyze reasons in terms of other sort of like properties. But for a while in philosophy, it was actually quite common to think that if you can understand what a reason is at all is in terms of coherence. So there was a prominent view where like the idea was like, well, what is it for me to have a reason? It's for me, it is for an idealized version of myself to be coherent in responding as that reason seems to indicate. So that's definitely a point of pushback that I think, the literature, to be honest, has moved a little bit beyond that discussion. But I think it's still a worthwhile sort of like pushback point.
And I guess the last thing that comes to mind, right, is because usually I rail against the notion of rationality.
Okay.
Right, because like you were saying, and I agree with everything you said, that we can understand rationality best if we look at the individual, right? And I don't believe in normative descriptions of rationality because then we have to believe in some kind of, normative ontological framework.
Good.
There's capital T truth,
Good.
and because especially when I look at the range of beliefs that we have in society at the moment, some people can be convinced of a range of things. So if we're defining rationality as internal to the system, and we have these other means of describing the way they engage with the world, like coherence, like reasonableness, then why do we need to roll it all up into something like rationality? Why can't we just discuss what the individual's beliefs are, the coherence of the individual, and then whether we perceive them as behaving reasonably or not? Like, do we need rationality at all?
So I would say that description corresponds to these two ideas of rationality. So the coherence one is just, people in the literature call it structural rationality. But then what you said, like we also want to evaluate the reasonableness of the person, right? And
not objectively, sort of it's like a
Okay.
subjective description.
Subjective,
like I
okay.
think they're being reasonable, they think they're being unreasonable.
Got it.
Et cetera.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so what I understand you as saying is it's going to be fraught to find this sort of like a purely objective, kind of factual way of sort of like evaluating a response in terms of whether it's rational or not. All that we have to go by is like how the response fits into a broader pattern of responses, both in that person and also in external observers. And I totally like that view.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. So notice that the people who like the sort of like substantive rationality idea, and who think that not only this is an important dimension of rationality, but it's the basic dimension of rationality, do have to commit themselves to this sort of like very objectively flavor idea of what it is to be rational. And then someone who has more sort of like more like of an empiricist leaning is going to prefer more the coherentist view. And as a matter of fact, one of the biggest empiricists of all time, Hume, he thought that, to the extent that we have a grip of what rationality is, it's just pure coherence. So he has this like famous phrase where he says like it's not contrary to reason to prefer the destruction of the whole world to the scratching of my finger. Meaning, I mean, if a preference seems unreasonable, it's that one. But he was like, that's not contrary to reason, because all that rationality imposes on you is a constraint of coherence. I like that view.
Since you started talking about the reason more, like one thing that is still in my mind is like, because in philosophy of action, we talk about reasons. Like when you act, like we are talking about human action, like you have a reason to act.
Yeah.
And that reason is mostly understood as like an intention. Like there's always some intention behind your action. And this seems to me a different way of understanding reason
yes.
than what you were talking about. Or
Yeah, absolutely. That's a different way. So one common distinction that people draw is between normative and motivating reasons. So motivating reasons is exactly what you just described. So it's the reasons that motivate the agent to do something. On a common understanding, they're just mental states. And on a common human understanding, they're just pairs of beliefs and desires. So the motivating reason for me to come here is because I want to talk to you guys, and I believe that by being in this room, I can talk to you guys. So I cited a belief and a desire, and those are my motivating reasons. But the people who have engaged with like the substantive rationality idea on this like meta ethics of rationality literature, they have a different idea of reason in mind, where it's like a normative reason, and a normative reason is a fact. Or on one common view is a fact. It's a fact that has a genuine normative significance. Yeah. And that's where the connection with objectivity comes in, right? It's a fact, and the fact objectively sort of like has some sort of significance, speaks in favor of some sort of response, and rationality consists in responding correctly to those facts that we have access to. So it's a very sort of like objectively charged notion of what it means to be rational.
But what kind of facts we are talking about?
So it could be, there's different kinds of facts. Let's say like the fact that I'm hungry is a reason for me to have some food. So that's a very simple kind of fact. The fact that I can only get shoes at the mall is a reason for me to go to the mall to buy shoes if I have the plan to buy shoes. So it's facts out there in the world that have some sort of normative significance, and human beings have the capacity, according to these views, to respond to those reasons, to sort of appreciate what those facts are, appreciate their normative significance, and respond appropriately.
Yeah, I see.
Yeah, I think that maybe we can shift into social norms soon. But there's one other thing I kind of want to bring up, which is the notion of ignorance, which I think is quite interesting given this context, right?
Okay.
Because there are things that we allow one to be ignorant of. So people who haven't checked in with to keep with the example, checked in with Pelin in the last half an hour, maybe don't know where Pelin is, right? And that's reasonable.
Good.
That's a reasonable thing. But if you ask that same person and they don't know their own name, then there's a big problem, right? And so you have graded ignorance, where some is acceptable, some is not acceptable.
Good.
And maybe you have some which is socially unacceptable, like it's not acceptable as an adult to not know who the prime minister of your country is, right?
Good.
That's not psychologically concerning, right? But it is maybe problematic, right? But not knowing your name is very concerning,
right?
So you kind of had this graded ignorance. Does that factor into kind of how you see coherence? Not only the knowledge that you have and the beliefs you maintain, but also maybe the information that you don't have?
That's super interesting. To be honest, I haven't thought much about this, but just hearing you just say that, I think that there's a distinction that we can draw between merely lacking knowledge and being ignorant. Mm-hmm. So the case where we don't know where Pelin is a case of merely lacking knowledge. Yeah. The case where you don't know your own name is a case of ignorance. And then the tricky question is going to become, well, what exactly, how do you understand the boundary between those two things, right? In the paper on coherence that I have with my colleague Sam Fullhart, we do discuss cases that are kind of similar to this. So these are not cases of ignorance per se, of lack of knowledge, but rather lack of belief, something that, a state that people call suspension of judgment. And there's a similar distinction that people make there. So it's one thing to just simply lack a belief in some proposition, maybe because you have never considered that proposition, right? And it's a different thing to suspend judgment about that proposition. So suspending judgment seems to involve some sort of reflection or pondering, and then some sort of decision to not commit yourself either to the truth or to the falsehood of the relevant proposition, right? And we do say in that paper that suspension of judgment is incoherent with some states. So it seems incoherent to suspend judgment about P, but also believe that P, right? That's gonna turn out to be incoherent. Or suspend judgment about P and believe that not P. So there are, the state of suspension of judgment does enter into coherence relations with some states. Now about ignorance, it could be that it's incoherent to be ignorant about your own name, and at the same time, well, I guess that's a tricky question. If it's something about you're not responding to your information, that would be a different sort of explanation. But maybe it's ignorant to not know your own name, but maybe also to sign a paper where you write your name. Although that's the action connection. But yeah, it's a fascinating question.
I like this distinction that you made, lacking knowledge and ignorance, because it's not that straightforward, because mostly ignorance is understood as lacking knowledge about some topic or so, but that's not really it, right? Because when we say that someone is ignorant about this, there's some judgment, a negative judgment. Exactly. It's as if you should know, but you don't know. In lacking knowledge, it's more neutral. You don't have this. You just lack knowledge, and there's no value laden there or so. But yeah, maybe we can talk about this one.
Absolutely. I was gonna say it seems to me that one promising way of drawing this distinction is precisely a normative sort of idea. So the idea is well, if I don't know where the Pope is right now, that's lack of knowledge because I'm not supposed to know. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. But if the Pope's aide doesn't know where the Pope is, that seems to be ignorance because they're supposed to know. So we're appealing in the background to a sort of norm, the sort of things that some people are supposed to know or not supposed to know. And then that's the thing that draws the boundary. But I know that some people study ignorance in philosophy and there's views about ignorance. So I don't know if I'm speaking out of ignorance or just lack of knowledge. but yeah, it's a fascinating distinction, I think. Yeah.
There is a cognitive science of ignorance, and there's a whole handbook built called the Virtues of Ignorance, which is specifically on this, which doesn't make it would say that lacking knowledge is a subset of ignorance. So it just kind of takes the catch-all term of ignorance as lacking information, lacking knowledge. And I think that's quite an interesting way, because then we look at there's a gradient of normativity, but maybe we just call it all ignorance,
right.
which I think could be quite interesting.
Right.
And you have some very interesting things about how a classic example actually done by Jonathan Kaminsky, who's in the cognitive science department here when he was at Yale. And it was looking at asking people to identify the crucial mechanism of a device that they use on a daily basis.
Mm-hmm.
So asking people to draw the crucial mechanism of a toilet, which is quite interesting because most people don't know. I also didn't realize what it was. I was like, it must be the tank above, which gravity pushes the water.
Yeah.
It's actually the bend in the tube under the toilet bowl.
Oh, I see.
So the bend in the pipe actually creates I had no idea. Then funnier ones, which I can do, which is put a bicycle chain on a bicycle.
Right.
And people look at a bicycle and they put the bicycle chain in all kinds of crazy ways, so it's actually really funny. But you have this thing where they use the mechanism.
Yeah.
They know when the mechanism is broken.
Yeah.
They might even be using a bicycle and understand that the problem with the bicycle is the chain.
Right.
Right. And when they see it, they can operate it, but they can't actually visualize what that is.
Very interesting.
This is a very strange type of gap in our knowledge.
Definitely. Yes, that's fascinating. Well, count me as one that also, I didn't also, no idea how a toilet works.
I want to delve into this idea that you are supposed to know something,
Mm-hmm.
What are the things that you are supposed to know, or how is it determined? I don't know, there's something there also connecting to some social context, I
Definitely,
think.
yeah.
Maybe you want to say more about that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, this is going to be very sort of rudimentary, but I do think that there are epistemic demands associated with social roles. So in the case of the Pope, the aide is supposed to know where the Pope is. I, as a philosopher, I'm supposed to know certain things. So we definitely think that people who occupy certain social roles are under some sort of epistemic demands, and those epistemic demands are going to be the object of social norms. So if you don't know the things you're supposed to know, then other people are going to be, they're going to be critical of you, they're going to disapprove of you, and you're going to face some sort of social sanctioning. So yeah, I think definitely that's part of our idea of what a social role is.
Yeah, and we can even, I think, see how it is changing by time. What are the things that we are supposed to know back in, I don't know, let's say 2000s, early 2000s, when we were not asking every question and typing it on internet to find out the reason. It seemed to me back then that we are supposed to know lots of, I don't know, trivial facts and all. But right now, actually, nobody values those kind of knowledge, because it's okay, you can just ask and get the answer on the spot. Why are you filling your mind with those kind of information? So not only from one social context to another, but also I think temporally it is changing a lot, and it's
definitely, and that makes me think of this sort of observation that we have made, that in the past taxi drivers used to know all the streets in the city, and now that we have Waze and Google Map and so on, that knowledge has been lost, right? So that also shows that knowledge is very sensitive to the sort of needs of a community. And once the community invents a technology where they can sort of store that knowledge, then some embodied ways of having the knowledge are no longer useful and therefore disappear.
That's a very interesting example, because this is a hot topic in AI ethics, the negative sides of really using this advanced technologies. I mean, now GPS is not really that advanced anymore, but it's a technology that is commonly used. And what is it doing to us? Are we losing some skills that we should actually have? But also there are other views saying that no, actually it is kind of part of your mind and body. It's it's just complementing. I don't know where I'm standing at that, but it's a really hot topic.
Yeah, that's super interesting, and it kind of connects with my research on norms, because one of the things that I sort of like want to say about norms is that they're really a part of culture. And what I mean by that is it's something, quite technical. So culture is the body of knowledge that human beings have accumulated across generations because it's adaptive, right? Mm-hmm. So we have knowledge about like what plants we can eat, about where to find water, all sorts of like skills that we gain from people in a community, how to, back in the day, how to fish, how to hunt, and so on. So if that's culture, well, what seems to be going in the case of the taxi drivers is a sort of like post-cultural sort of like situation where technology comes in, and then technology becomes comes to be the place where we store the knowledge, not in culture, not in our embodied physical minds and the skills that come with them, but rather in some sort of like external source. So it's an interesting connection.
Yeah, it also seems like the discussion's been happening for a long time. With Plato wanting to memorize everything, right? And Aristotle being like, I think we can just not.
That is true.
It's an interesting type of kids these days.
Right.
And because we also, the extended mind hypothesis, which is kind of what you're getting into, Pelin, is really interesting because we can ostensibly free up more of our mind by using the tools. But is there something lost when we don't actually actively memorize and recall? And I think there's a difficult balance there to keep.
Yeah, for sure.
And we also have situations where I'm thinking about when it is actually virtuous to say that we're ignorant, right? As opposed to, because you have certain situations where knowledge, there are norms around, say, teaching. Mm-hmm. So you have an institutional type of knowledge where a teacher, an ideal teacher says that they're ignorant when they're ignorant, right? But then there are certain norms where the teacher feels like they should know, and therefore they will almost get upset with a student if they point out something that they don't know or they're incorrect.
Definitely.
And I think that's quite interesting. But then you also have, coming back to the norms, is we engage in a type of social contract. I invite you to the podcast to record. If I have no idea how to get the keys or how to record and I've told you I have a podcast, it would be really upsetting to get here and be like, oh, I have no idea how to do this. I was hoping you guys did, right? So there's something there about structurally planned in that we all infer from our environments that we learn about, like teachers, and then things that we do ad hoc. So about commitment and things like that, where we don't need to even explicitly commit. There's just a norm, certain norms about assumptions that we infer about one another.
Definitely, yeah. So there's like social norms, which is the case of the teacher, but also just like norms associated with joint action or like with joint instrumental rationality. If we're doing something together, you're doing your part, I'm doing mine, then you're supposed to know how to do your part. Definitely. So there's going to be like a lot of norms that engage this idea of you're supposed to have some knowledge. And then maybe that's going to be the thing that allows us to identify ignorance in this sort of like philosophically interesting way.
And what happens when because now I'm thinking of cases like some norms could conflict with each other. For example, the norms I put for myself, like that I follow the rules, as famously Kant suggests, and also the rules that the society puts in front of, and I need to follow them somehow to be part of the society. And also there are, norms in my family, and it's pretty plausible to think that they could really come conflict, and I don't know what to think about that.
I think that's one of the most sort of anxiety-inducing sort of things that come with being a social species. Right? It's like so. Here's an interesting fact about social norms. They're just informal. So it's not like the law, right? So it's not with the law. The law is written down. There's clear mechanisms for creating laws, for changing laws. And with those mechanisms and, the writing down of the law comes coherence, right? Although that's also tricky because sometimes legal scholars get into heated debates about what exactly the law requires. But you would expect there to be more coherence with respect to the law that with respect to social norms are just informal. They're not, there's no explicit mechanisms for creating them. There's no explicit mechanisms for changing them. It's not even clear what it means to say that social norm exists. And that often results in a lot of ambiguity
Yeah.
and a lot of conflict.
Yeah.
So you could end up in a situation where you are under like very different demands on what you're supposed to do. And I guess literature is filled with examples like this. Sometimes even the same social norm is kind of internally incoherent. So one example I like is politeness, right? So it's impolite to do certain things. But also when someone does something impolite, it's also impolite to point that out.
Yeah.
So that seems to be a sort of internal contradiction to the very norm of politeness. But this sort of ambiguity, inconsistency is just part and parcel of social norms.
Definitely anxiety-inducing. I agree with that.
Great.
Yeah, because we even create subsets of norms within groups. And,
Yes.
and what we do, we have different relationships with people. So it's okay for one to be, naked in front of their partner, but you don't get naked in this setting, right? It would be very strange if you did that. But when you go home and do that, it could be perfectly fine.
Definitely.
And so you have these subset of norms, which we also, I think, cognitively, it's really interesting how we can make these inferences about what's okay and how we can maintain that in broader groups.
Yeah.
So I have kind of a nuclear unit that I might have a large amount of norms with, and like a broad subset and things that are very tolerable. And then that expands to contain my group of close friends, and then it's slightly broader. And there's almost like a narrowing of what we think is acceptable when we engage with people that we don't know. So as I move through people that I don't know at all, I'm going to behave in a very particular way.
Definitely.
And we're going to behave with the minimum. We behave with sort of the normative minimum of what's acceptable.
Right.
And then with familiarity, we can expand what that minimum is.
Definitely. Yeah, I think I completely agree with that observation. I think it's a very interesting, it shows something really deep about norms, which is that they are these like tools for social interaction. And that means they're going to be like really handy when you don't know the other person all that well. If you know the other person reasonably well, you can sort of like form expectations about how they're going to behave. You kind of know their tastes, you know their projects. Then in those kinds of scenarios, then norms can actually be an obstacle. But in cases where you don't have a lot of information about the other guy or the other person, then norms are going to be become really handy because they give you this default mode of interaction, which is kind of like tried and tested by culture. Might not be perfect, but it gives you something to hang on to. And that also makes me think about another sort of connection, speaking about like the different dimensions where norms are sort of like operative. I think that's also something very interesting about creating relationships or establishing relationship with people, which is like in the beginning of a friendship or a romantic relationship, say, the interactions tend to be more normatively infused because people don't know each other that well. But one of the things that happens is like as you get to know the person better, you're also negotiating the social norms. So there's a lot of tailoring of the social norms that apply socially to the specific case of this relationship. And I think that's something that humans do, and it's fascinating. Yeah,
I think that is, I like this a lot because that has something to do with also in general, like love, like philosophy of love, like because maybe some people said, like some people, I think this was also Plato back then said that your partner, like romantic partner, is like one soul, like separated two. So maybe we are not even talking about some social context once we are talking about a romantic partnership. We are talking about becoming one person and then the social norms are disappearing.
right. Or your states become so coherent that you're just like one individual. For sure.
The dyad, I think, is very, very interesting when we get into behavior.
But I have a question about social norms. Like, how do we choose one norm over other? Like, I don't know, at some point, there are some established norms. Like, I don't know, maybe not lying to your, like, friend. Let's say this is some kind of established norm. And at some point in time, like, somebody said that, oh, let's like this should be the norm, you know,
Yeah.
like, and but I don't think they chose this because they tried every kind of norm that they could come up, and then they said, oh, you know, this one works. This doesn't seem like the way to do it. I don't know how. Yeah,
great. So you're absolutely right. I don't think that, or the cases where people do that are really few and far between. So the sort of view I like about social norms, as I said, sees them as part of culture, and as part of culture sees them as culturally evolved things. So the idea that norms are culturally evolved things actually goes back all the way to Hume, who I've mentioned a lot in this podcast. But the idea, so Hume was reacting to, among others, Hobbes. So Hobbes is someone who comes from the social contract tradition, and he thought political institutions, political norms are the product of this sort of like explicit agreement between rational parties. Of course, there's sort of like interpretation question about to what extent he meant that as something that really happens, right? But Hume said, like, you don't have to think of norms and institutions that way. You can think of norms as institutions as the sort of like result of like a gradual process of social evolution where people try out different ideas and then they kind of all converge on good ideas or on ideas that help them like coordinate more efficiently or cooperate with one another or to trust one another. So there's no like moment in time where people get together in a sort of town hall assembly and decide like now we're going to start sort of like punishing the people who cheat on their partners. That's not how it goes. It's like at any given moment in time, there's different norms in a community and people live in different ways. It just happens that some of those are more successful culturally, and those that are more successful culturally get copied more, get taught more often, and then they spread in the population, and that's how you end up with everyone following a certain norm.
Yeah, and you have situations where people codify norms explicitly through legal frameworks. So we can look at extreme examples of, it's just salient right now, but like the Taliban taking over in Afghanistan. Yeah. So they have certain norms and they impose it. And you can have sort of similar reactionary norms where, France pushes a ban on the hijab. And so you have all there's different types of things where people are imposing what they see as their social norm legally. Yeah. Which then, of course, is any type of oppression, in either end, in either case. Yeah. But I think this interesting thing happens where generationally, norms develop within a generation as they're coming up. Yeah. And so every generation is a reaction generation to what exists, whether it's directly a generation before or their parents, probably the strongest reaction of their parents. And then they, as they age, start to shape community and culture at large. Yeah. So whatever generation Alpha does right now, how they shape the culture will end up being probably the predominant culture by the time we're 80. Yeah. And then likewise, the generation that what we've created as millennials is kind of becoming dominant. The things that we accept, the things that we tolerate. Definitely. Yeah. And there's this interesting aspect about that because then you have some things that are handed down. I think the evolution, usually I'm the one defending Hume in a conversation, so I like that this is what's going on because I'm a fan. But I think the notion of evolution, at least as a very rough concept, sort of the core principle of it, right? Which is that there's no planned structure to things. They're just tried and tested. They emerge, subside, is a very tempting one. And I think you'd also find a lot of support in contemporary cognitive science, where we look at the cognitive science of norms in this way, in evolutionary terms.
That's super interesting. Yeah, just to say something about this, like intergenerational dynamics, I think that's super crucial. And as a matter of fact, people who study culture evolution have pointed out that for culture evolution to work, it cannot be the case that everyone in a community obtains all their information through others, through social learning. You gotta have in the community someone who's still doing their own thing, exploring the world, and coming up with new ideas, right? Otherwise, kind of like cultural evolution just stagnates. And, some people have made the case that that's the reason why small kids and like teenagers just like are so rebellious. They just go against the existing norms because we need that as a species. We need some people who are trying out new ideas because, of course, norms are only successful if they allow us to adapt, well to our environment, but the environment is always changing, right? So as a matter of fact, Alison Gopnik has this like really nice phrase where she says like kids and teenagers are the R&R wing of society, which is a beautiful and really nice way of putting it. You just need people who are innovating and experimenting with new ideas, definitely. Yeah.
But something that puzzles me a little bit, because in Hope's picture, like there are institutions and some authorities says that, okay, this is how the things should be done. Like the oath of like norms are coming from those like authorities. In the cultural evolutionary picture, your view and human view, like there's no such authority that makes those rules.
Definitely.
Then how that just we doing stuff turns to, oh yes, we ought to do those stuff. Like,
yes.
I mean, that's the famous question to Hume also. How does it turns to ought? And
yes, beautiful. Great question. Yeah, so Hobbes has this phrase somewhere. He says like, covenants without sword are mere words. Right, that's exactly the point. Right, so if you don't have like a strong authority backing the agreement, then it's not going to be really effective, right? And that in the social norms literature, that has been a big problem. So a lot of people who study social norms do it from a rational choice perspective, where the idea is like, well, to the extent that we follow norms, this is because it's a sort of like rational things for us to do. But then one natural way of cashing out that idea is like in terms of sanctions. So other people sanction you if you don't follow the norms. If you don't stand in line, other people are going to sanction you, shame you. But then there's a big problem of what justifies the sanctioning. And I just want to flag, that's a big complicated problem. I just want to flag that is basically a problem. Like, how is it that social norms are effective if really we follow them out of like some sort of rational calculation? There's different ways of sort of like tackling that question. Some people think that norms are internalized. So when you're small, you sort of like just like soak up some norms in your community, and just in virtue of the way in which you are like psychologically predisposed, you end up acquiring some sort of intrinsic motivation to follow the norm. So this is a view that says like we don't follow norms because of the sanctions. We follow the sanctions might be there and might give you an extra motive to follow norms, but most of the time we just follow norms because we have this intrinsic motivation to follow the norms, and that sort of like gets rid of the problem on one level. But another view that I like, and that connects to the second part of your question, which is like this challenge to the Humean picture, where it's like, well, if you have like this story of like how these conventions appear, and then what makes them normative, right? What makes it the case that we think about them in terms of an ought and not just in terms of an is? And I have this paper that came out like last year where I tried to say something about that question, and essentially that's a challenge that has been raised by some people to this picture. The idea is like, well, these like Humean accounts of norms only get you behavioral regularities, behavioral patterns in the population. They don't get you the psychological side of norms. Part of that psychology is this ideas of like right and wrong. And what I say in that paper is you have to look at teaching. And teaching is the crucial thing, at least from the point of view of the evolution of our cognitive capacities, that really brings into the fore these attitudes of thinking that something is right or wrong, and of wanting to punish and to wanting to correct someone else. So the idea is like, yeah, well, in some circumstances, some of these like good social ideas are going to require teaching to become really stable in the course of cultural evolution. But teaching is just like a normative activity. When I'm teaching you how to do something, so people who write about this really focus on cases of like tool making. So tool making was really important at some point in the history. So if I'm teaching you how to make an axe out of stone, say, where you have to like hit one rock with the other. It's really dangerous because you might cut yourself. I'm going to have an idea in my mind of what you're supposed to do. Mm-hmm. And that idea is not just a sort of like descriptive idea. It's not like this is now going to happen, but this is what's supposed to happen now. And if you don't do that, then I have to have some sort of like disposition or some sort of motivation to come in and say like, no, Pelin, you're doing it wrong. That's not how you do it.
Correcting it.
Correct you, exactly. So I think that the activity of teaching something just is infused with a normativity, and then therefore appealing to the fact that a lot of norms are transmitted through teaching is a way of accounting for their sort of like normative force.
So what does teaching involve? Like, it's not only about like saying what you are going to do. It involves more than that, no?
Yeah, so there's a lot of things that involve. So one thing is like verbal instructions, but also demonstrations. I show you, here's the stone, here's how you do it, right? Correction. If you don't do it right, I step in, I say, no, do it this way, do it that way. There's other stuff it involves is some people call it opportunity provisioning. So that's a bit more indirect, but it's the idea that part of what I do in teaching is offer you opportunities to do things that you would otherwise not have. So when you're learning how to like make the tool, I let you hang out around me and observe me when I'm doing the thing, also see some of the materials that are in the floor and sort of like explore them, see them. So those are opportunities that you would not have if I were not teaching you, right? So I'm provisioning you with opportunities to learn. So it involves a range of activities.
So I can jump in on a couple of things.
Yeah.
I like where this is going. So first, it's interesting because how we describe what you guys were just talking about is ostensive versus non-ostensive teaching. Okay. Mm-hmm. And we make this distinction primarily because humans seem to be the only animals that do ostensive teaching. Right. So, and ostensive learning. So we're able to both say, hey, look at this, I'm going to show you how to do it, and also respond to somebody telling me that and then actually observe. Right. Whereas every other species works on exposure, like you're saying, right? This opportunity, which is non-ostensive. They do it. There's no point at which a chimp grabs a smaller chimp, brings them closer, and does it in front of them. It's more that they are doing it, and there's a curiosity there, and the younger chimp comes and stays close by. So I think that is really interesting in terms of norms, because norms, there is this imitation phase, which is kind of what you were alluding to with children picking up everything. Right. Is in the early phase of life, children go through a very extensive imitation phase, right, where they put on your hats, they put on your shoes, they eat the way you eat, they want to use a fork and knife. And so this imitation phase, particularly of the caregivers, is crucial for their social development. And by the time they're 3, this is basically over. Mm-hmm. If it even lasts until 2.5, that's a good amount. But right up until then, they're soaking up everything. Right. And it's easy for them to do that because usually the primary exposure they have is through primary caregivers. So the information they're getting through imitation is pretty consistent. So they have the same types of norms that they're inferring. Right. And then later, as they start picking up language, which again is the same kind of thing, it's just inference-based and exposure, then you can normatively sort of explain. And I think it's interesting because you have, that leads into, when you get into teenagers with this kind of first-hand empiricism need, mm-hmm. they don't take things for granted, they need to always push the envelope. But by the time you get to adulthood, I think I hadn't heard that quote from Hobbes, but I think I see him as like the eternal pessimist, in human disposition and behavior side. That really tracks. Right. But because I completely agree with you. If I understood what you were saying, which is people coordinate because it reduces friction. Yeah. And so every time we engage with others, there's something that we might want. Yeah. Right. And so we might want enjoyment with the other person, or we might want something that we might get from that other person. Either way, if we appeal to the norms that we both share, then we're reducing the friction there. Definitely. And I think that drive towards coordination is much stronger than the fear of retribution. And I think that's actually what's guiding a lot more of our behavior, because retribution is less common in our everyday lives. But coordination is extremely common, and socialization is a huge motivator for us. Yeah.
I see. So the point is like, it's not either you have an intrinsic motivation where you value the norm as such. But it's also not necessarily sanctioning and disapproval and retribution. It might be that as human beings, we really value coordination. We really value interacting without any sort of like friction. There's nothing worse than an awkward pause or something. And then the idea is like that's going to be the thing that drives conformity to norms in a lot of cases. Even when you know that maybe there's another thing that you might do that's better under the circumstances, you might value social coordination so much that you do the thing that you're expected to do. I hadn't thought that, and that's super fascinating. Yeah.
Yeah, because we look a lot at, I think reputation management is a lot about guides our behavior.
Yeah.
And because of the strong drive towards socialization,
right.
It ends up driving a lot. And I think that with enforcement, you get this interesting thing because we have, if we are not cheating in a particular game, I think that enforcement comes in two flavors, and based on your context, you might behave differently in different times. I don't think anybody always follows one way about this, but you can have the empathy, right? With I don't cheat not because in society or whatever, not because I am afraid of enforcement, but because I feel empathy towards the people that I might be cheating.
Right.
I think that that's the larger driver.
Yeah.
But I think in some cases, even where that's not the case, there is this mutual enforcement because there's a sense of, well, I didn't, and so I have a cost from not doing it. And so I ought to also impose that cost on you because then that's fair.
Right.
And I think that in different contexts, we can have different drivers. I do think that empathy is guiding a lot of people's behaviors, but I do think that in cases where the empathy fails, this mutual cost sort of provision in the argument can pick up some of the slack.
Yeah, absolutely. That I think that's all probably what's really going on with a lot of people follow norms. I think that it's just a mixed it's a mix of motivations that drive us. I guess the people who are coming from the sort of like rational choice approach to these questions, I think like a charitable way of interpreting what they're saying is not that they don't recognize that there's not motives like empathy and fairness and so on. That I think that's really difficult. It's more like the idea like, look, if we cannot provide a sort of like rational reconstruction of the norm, an account where like following this is at least in the long term rational, we don't have an explanation of why those motives would stick in the long run. So why would people continue to be motivated by fairness and continue to be motivated by kindness and so on, and empathy, if in the long run it didn't somehow connect to the promotion of their ends? I think that's a charitable way of understanding like why these people are so concerned with sort of offering an explanation of following the norms in terms of rational incentives. But I think in the real world, you're absolutely right. It's a mix of motives.
We kind of touched on this when we were speaking earlier before the podcast, but do you ever think about the formalization through jurisprudence? You kind of touched on it, but...
So when norms become laws?
Yes.
Yeah. So earlier I said like there's this kind of sharp distinction between laws and norms. I actually think that, so my considered view is it's a continuum in the sense that you have norms that are very informal, not even explicit, like for instance, these norms that regulate the appropriate distance you're supposed to stand from a person when talking, you know? These vary across cultures. And then you have like circumstances when, you know, people from different cultures are speaking. Someone is really, you know, from a culture where they feel like really comfortable speaking from a close distance, and then the other person starts to like run away, quote unquote. So you have like those sorts of like implicit norms. You have more explicit norms that are not written down, like queuing in a coffee shop or something like that. Then you have like these like intermediate like cases of like stuff that is written down, but it's not really a legal norm. So a lot of religious norms might be examples of this, like prohibitions against eating some sort of like foods that are written down in the texts of the relevant religion, but it's not really a legal norm. Although you could call it the laws of like X or Y religion. And then you have like the laws of democracy, say, which have like this like explicit way of being created, explicit way of being changed. That seems more to me like a spectrum. And there's going to be a lot of interesting interactions between those different categories. Sometimes the law really matters. Sometimes you might have a written law, but the law is not, it's superseded by a social norm. So I was once like driving in the US on a highway, and I was going at the speed limit, me and some friends, and people behind us started honking. And we were like, what's going on? Why are they honking? Then we realized the social norm in that highway is actually going above the speed limit. So you have a case here, we have a written down law, presumably enforced by legal sanctions, but it's the social norm that really drives behavior. And I think that's really like a testament to the power of social norms. Yeah.
I'm like thinking about, we are mostly talking about like somehow rational or reasonable good laws, let's say. And this picture makes sense. But once I start thinking about bad norms, I don't know, like the wrong laws, like norms, let's say, now that we talked about laws, but I agree that I think there's some continuity. But let's go back to norms. And I'm thinking about, for example, 200 years ago, even 100 years ago, like how women were treated in society or so. This was a social norm.
Yes.
Like, and we can go even further, and like ancient times, women were really, it was a very established, legitimate, like norm that women were treated as like almost I don't know, slaves, women, animals, and men are on the top of the hierarchy. So this was definitely a social norm, and it even turned into a law that women didn't have like any right to vote or something. They are all in a continuity. How those get evolved in, it doesn't seem like they were evolved because it was easy to coordinate and like it was rational somehow. Right. Like, I don't know, how does this fit in the human picture?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think that's actually a very interesting question, and it is a challenge for the sort of human program that I have in mind and that I sort of like endorse. So in that text by Hume, he was talking about the private property, right? Mm-hmm. But I do think that there is a story that Humeans can tell about these kinds of norms, and it actually has been told. So Kaylin O'Connor, who is a professor of philosophy at UC Irvine in California, I think she published a book in 2018, if I'm correct, called The Origins of Unfairness. Mm-hmm. And I think she has this sort of like broadly Humean take on how norms that are unfair, and one of her like recurrent examples is gender norms, might emerge as a result of these sorts of evolutionary processes. So one way of seeing how this might work is like, well, human beings have needs to coordinate all sorts of things, right? One thing that they need to coordinate is, for instance, division of labor. You need to, someone to take care of the kids. You need someone to hunt, blah, blah, blah. When you have an observable difference between people in a population, an external observable difference, then she shows that the dynamics of cultural evolution can really use that, can piggyback on that observable difference to solve the relevant coordination problem. So that's one way of seeing how some gender norms, at least, might appear through these kinds of processes. You have the need for people to do different things. Then there's a clear observable difference in the people. Let's divide tasks based on the observable difference. And that gets you some way towards explaining gender norms, some racist norms, some like caste systems, for instance. But you are absolutely right to push this point. There seems to be some gender norms that it's going to be really hard to explain from this kind of framework, and then we're going to have to rely on other frameworks, but that's also fine.
Yeah, but these observable features, that definitely makes sense. And this is also one of the oldest arguments for inequality between men and women. So, it fits into the picture,
Right.
Yeah, Guilherme and I talk about power all the time, right? Because Guilherme works on power and the emergence of hierarchies. And the view that I take is that before you had anything sort of explicit about societal contracts, not written down explicit, but in terms of action and how we coordinate, there was the possibility for, in some communities, force to be the dominant currency. And I don't think that was necessarily universally present, but the communities that did adopt force as the currency were then able to export that, right? And then potentially dominate. And then you get this gender normativity emerging purely because when violence is the currency, one group might be able to win out over the other.
Yep.
But I see the change that occurs as when we have legal change, like change in the frameworks, what in this specific case, what women are entitled to legally, I see it as the change in the norm in the standard Humean way, and then that the politics has to react to that. And if you get enough situations, successive generations, because women were fighting for suffrage for a very long time before, in say the turn of the 20th century, in many countries, the tide started to shift. I think that it just took a long time for that norm to change, right? Where people were able to talk about women's suffrage more and more publicly.
Yeah.
And if you even look at how people were defending their arguments against women's suffrage in the United States it was 1919. If you look at how men were talking about it, people opposed to it were talking about even in the 1920s, they would still vocally say that they were against it. But who today would say that they were against women's suffrage? Right. I mean, that would be completely ludicrous.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting because it seems like a tipping point of the norm where the law has to cave.
Yeah.
Otherwise, there's revolution, right? Or just at least political and economic instability. And then even after the change, you have this lingering norm where it's okay to talk about being in opposition to it.
Yeah.
But you get to a point where it's not even okay to talk about it. So I think that I do see the case that you're making as being consistent with that, and the laws mostly in reaction to this. Does that tracks for you too?
Yeah, absolutely. It's another interesting example of the interaction between informal norms and formal legal norms. So you can definitely have cases where a norm that was, let's call it, broadly functional at some point in time gets elevated to the status of a law. That brings in some sort of like state power to bear. That brings in some legal enforcement to bear. And then the dynamics of cultural evolution, takes the community away from that norm, but it's still in the law. And then the question is, how do you change the law? And something you said was interesting is like there's also these like meta norms about the acceptability of discussing the thing. And that sort of connects with this idea that law not only is this like mechanism for coordination and, is backed by like formal sanctions and so on. Some people that think that when a certain sort of conduct is law, that's also has some sort of expressive function, some sort of signaling function. It's telling to the members of the community, this is okay, right? And I think that that's one reason to sort of like get rid of bad laws that are no longer really sort of like, they don't matter that much. So recently, I think New York got rid of some like adultery laws from like back in the day that no one really sort of like paid attention to. Well, one reason to do that sort of thing is that insofar as you have the law, you still have the expressive thing saying like, this is this is the right way of acting. So yeah, you definitely can get these interesting dynamics.
And you have this interesting case where you have what the law says, and then you have people who have different interpretations of how to interpret what the law says.
Yeah.
So you have people who argue for original textual interpretations of it, what all the words in the law meant at the time they were written,
right,
versus more contemporary interpretationalists, which is we should interpret what that means in this context. And I just see the role of every judge to compare what they see as the norm of the moment and the interpretation of the law as contemporary.
Yep.
And I think this is in most countries that have Supreme Courts, you take the law up to the Supreme Court not so that they can rewrite the law. In fact, what they do is offer an interpretation of the law.
Exactly.
And I think this is highly contingent upon norms.
Absolutely, yes. I was going to say just that. So sometimes if you draw to sort of like sharp a distinction between the informal and the formal, you also miss out on the fact that the formal to work relies on a lot of informal norms and practices. Like, for instance, a tradition of reading the texts in a certain sort of way, right? So this happens in democracy as well, by the way. So if you think of democracy, you can think of democracy as a system of formal rules and procedures, but you can also think about it in a more like robust way as those rules and procedures accompanied by a sort of culture of informal norms. It's a culture of we accept the results of elections, we alternate power. So there's a bunch of practices that are informal, they're not written down, but that sort of like infuse the life into the formal stuff, and that are absolutely necessary to keep the formal stuff up and running. Yeah.
Cool. So we can slowly start winding down, but before I get into the last question or two, is there anything else that you want to touch on?
Well, I guess that last thing I said is connected to some of the work I'm doing with the Knowledge in Crisis project. So in the project, we do a lot of like research of different kinds, but something that I've been sort of thinking about in connection to the idea of there being a crisis of knowledge is if a lot of aspects of that crisis can be explained precisely in terms of erosion of social norms. So I think there's this tendency in people who work on this sort of like applied epistemology questions of seeing the crisis of knowledge as some sort of like epistemic problem, And but what I mean by epistemic problem is just some failure of people to conform to some or other epistemic standard. So some people think it's about rationality. People are really irrational right now. They don't care about evidence. They don't care about inquiry. Other people think it's about trust. So people are not trusting the relevant authorities and the experts. Other people are even more extreme and say, no, it's about the very notion of truth. It's that's the thing that's sort of dying in our culture. And I want to sort of like make the case that a lot of the stuff that we associate with the crisis of knowledge is actually a social and political kind of crisis. It's a crisis of the norms that as a community we have that have an epistemic dimension, but are at bottom social or political norms. So I'm working on this paper at the moment about post-truth and how to understand post-truth. And my take is like, well, this is not an epistemic crisis. It's the crisis of the erosion of a certain norm, whereby people in a political community are supposed to defer to experts on some factual matters. And post-truth can be understood as a situation where that norm is being undermined very much explicitly by certain people in power.
Yeah, because it seems like you're able to deny certain institutional norms and institutional trust when the institutions have been so successful that you're shielded from the negative externalities of not believing that.
Yeah.
And so whether or not you believe in measles becomes less relevant if most people believe in measles and they get the measles vaccine.
Right.
You're shielded.
Yes.
And I think that the success of the institutions almost allows for a belief that the institution is redundant.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So when the institution is successful, you can free ride on the benefits of the institution. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
I just want to say something about, again, going back to unfair norms, and it is related to also knowledge in crisis, because there are norms that are eroding, and so maybe there's this one framework, one narrative about how norms are emerged, and there's also things to say about how should they emerge. I don't know what is your opinion about that, but I feel like there are lots of arguments actually one could offer to say that, this is how is turned to ought, but actually this shouldn't be the picture for very good reasons. Gender norms is one example. Like right now, the crisis in knowledge, it's another example. Maybe there's some problem with how norms are established. I mean, of course, maybe you cannot argue against it because this is how it is.
Yeah.
But I somehow can think that there could be philosophers who says that this is the ideal picture.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I haven't actually thought of those questions so I guess one big picture question is, should we have social norms? Or if we have them, should we evade them? Is there, And I guess you can go different ways with respect to that question. I do think that some social norms it's going to be really hard to get rid of norms. So any sort of view that defends the idea that we shouldn't have social norms is going to defend that as a sort of ideal that we can aspire to but not really realize, I think. If the view is something like we shouldn't pay attention to them, I do think that some norms are really important, and some norms are really the sort of things that really support beneficial and fair forms of coordination and cooperation. I think that the question is more subtle, where it's like we have to identify what are the bad norms out there, and we have to sort of like fight against those norms. But we also have to realize that in many ways our societies are kind of set up to produce bad norms. So one of the interesting sort of like results of the research of Kaylin O'Connor that I mentioned is that she gives what she calls a how minimally explanation of the emergence of some of these norms, right? So one reaction you might have is like, oh, that's not the explanation why we have gender norms. We have gender norms because of power, or we have gender norms because of biases that people have, right? Where they hate women. And O'Connor says something very interesting, which is like, yeah, it might be that that's what actually goes on in the real world. But what I'm giving you in these explanations, in these models, is a how minimally explanation. That is like a sort of like description of the minimal conditions under which you're going to get an unfair norm. And then that means that if you get rid of bias, if you get rid of power, if you don't get rid of the other stuff, then you might still get norms that are not good. So I think, social evolution gives us a lot of like good things, but it also sets us up to get a lot of bad things. And I think part of like being a sort of like politically, socially aware person is like always being on guard against the ways in which, this like fabulous, in some sense, process is also giving us bad stuff.
Yeah. Can we say that the answer and solution lies in some resistance and revolution, acts and notions like that? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, because it's the idea that we might not need norms is kind of like saying we don't need a common language, right? Because it's how we engage with one another.
Yeah.
And yeah, we ought to improve the language based on what we need, and we certainly ought to resist, reject, improve norms that we don't think are just. And I think it seems to speak to what our foundational beliefs are, right? And we might construct norms based on that. And I think that maybe the struggles, the conflicts between cultures is that they are saying, well, our foundational beliefs say this, and the norms that we construct are based on those. And then, of course, you have a different set of beliefs, right, forming a new foundation. And there are certain things that you can kind of take for granted when you go in the world that are beliefs that everybody else has, beliefs about their own, say, safety and security, that we shouldn't attack one another in the street. Yeah. And as long as we kind of obey those, there's some minimal standard that we all reach, but then we can define them in our own homes. And of course, the main question is when you have norms that are sort of out in public, the generally accepted norms, if those are misogynist, racist, any promoting any type of inequality, how do you go out in the street and on a daily basis resist that? And I think that's quite interesting, right? Is that most of the time it just seems like being out in the street and existing in a way where you don't tolerate the norms just seems like enough. Yeah. Right? And that's what a public demonstration is. That's what wearing, holding a sign or wearing a T-shirt is, right? Definitely. Every time I see people with writing on their T-shirts, I always think, what is that? Because it's such a strange thing to have some slogan on your T-shirt, unless it's something inane. Yeah. I mean, if it's something inane, then it's even more confusing to me, right? Like if it just says New York on your T-shirt, it's just strange. I don't know why I want a T-shirt that just says New York. Yeah. But when it has a political, cultural, social ideology, I think that's quite interesting because it's almost it's a small act of resistance from what you see because you see it as necessary. I'm not going to wear a shirt that says the world is round. Right. Most people are like, that's a weird shirt. I get it, I agree, but why are you wearing it?
Yeah.
You know, but I might wear something like the earth is flat because there are people who disagree, and now it's a statement.
Definitely.
I exist.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you bring up an interesting point, an interesting epistemic point about norms, which is like, since, at least in the paradigm case, they're not written, they're not formal, the only way we know they exist is because we see other people follow them and we see other people talk about them. So if you want to challenge a norm, one thing you're going to do is act against it, because then you're giving other people information that the norm is weakening and maybe that the norm doesn't exist anymore. So that's one really good explanation for why going out on the street to protest some, like, you know, foul norms or foul laws for the matters is really something that can be effective.
There are two famous cases in New York City, which I find very entertaining, which have annual celebrations, I would say. One is that people made the case that just having underwear on is not indecent, and it was never written. As long as you're not nude, you know, it's the law is around nudity, but there was a norm around indecency of underwear, right? And so people started this thing called the No Pants Subway Ride, which happens every year in New York, where people are on the subway. And I used to do this every year while I was there as well. And people keep their underwear on, take their pants off, and we all just ride the subway a few stops and then meet at the same place. Wow. And it's just this way of saying, like, yeah, there's this norm, and we can challenge the norm, but it's obviously not about pants. It's about norms generally. You know, it's this broad thing. Yeah. And there's a similar case, I think, pushing even broader of a boundary that had to change a law, which is that women were like, well, men can be topless legally in New York City. Why can't women be topless legally in New York City? And they fought that battle, and they won that battle. Amazing. And now every year there's a sunbathing day where women are just topless in New York City. Great. And they're just like, everybody's like, we can be topless. We changed the law. There was a norm. We resisted the norm. The law had changed. And you have these two different cases, one where a law had to change, one where just the norm. But in both cases, the norms had to really push back. And it was people being in the street doing the thing. Right. And everybody just being like, okay, I guess we have to accept this.
With norms, there really is force in numbers. And if you get to the critical mass, if you get to the tipping point, then social change can happen really quickly. Maybe because we have this like urge to be coordinated. So if enough people do something and change, you know, the habits of society, then change can really cascade. But to speak about the point that you were raising, Pelin, I do think that it's healthy to cultivate a sort of like skeptical attitude towards norms. I think with any given social norm that imposes a demand on you, it's good to ask yourself, like, well, what's the point of this norm? Why is it useful? Why am I like following it? Which goes against some ways of thinking politically. So, for instance, conservatives are people who like really, so like notably, so like say like, look, if something is part of tradition, there's a presumption in its favor, because it being part of tradition sort of like means that it's doing something for us. And Daniel Kelly, who's a professor at Purdue, gave a talk here at CEU in April, and he was talking about this principle that conservatives like, which is like Chesterton's fence. So Chesterton, this British writer, has this book of essays where he talks about like this kind of case where, you know, if you see a fence between two like plots of land, there's a kind of like not very intelligent reformer who's going to say just like tear the fence down because it's not doing anything. But he says, Chesterton, who was a conservative, like a more intelligent sort of reformer will ask the question, what is this doing for us? And sort of like the presumption is if it's there, it's doing something for us. And, you know, I think like it cuts both ways as well. Like some people on the left are also like always trying to find functions to institutions and things. And I think like it's just healthy to cultivate this attitude of skepticism and asking yourself, well, what is really the point of this norm?
I think this really connects very nicely with your view on how norms are like by teaching somehow that turns out to be odd. Like because for it to be a really successful teaching, there must be someone who is learning, right? Like, and for good learning, and Ryle talks about it a lot, like you need critical capacity and you need to constantly monitor yourself, correct yourself. You sometimes even have to come up with your own method. So if we are really talking about like learning, you need to have this kind of attitude. Yeah.
Definitely, yeah. And in the paper I wrote, I was focused more on the side of the teacher.
Yeah, I realized that.
But it's definitely a super interesting question how things look like from the side of the person who's learning the norms, and how there's also probably going to be some sort of negotiation. Some sort of like tailoring of the norm to new purposes. And maybe that's also something that really drives social change.
And sometimes you learn something, even someone teaching you, like when you look at babies and all, parents always say, oh no, don't teach or don't say what should they do. They should discover their own things on their own.
Yes.
So real learning, actually, like if you would ask me, is really coming from you discovering your own methods, like without someone teaching. Of course, this is like not all the time this should be the case, but there's definitely something there that we can think of learning without the teaching part even.
Definitely. And that also speaks to this idea that, you have to cultivate this sort of critical attitude. That's essential to learn well, right? And maybe it is a norm of learning well that you cultivate this sort of critical attitude. Yeah. So total agreement here.
Yeah, maybe just one last thing, unless we want to dive into another topic as well, which is we have time, is these things. I think that when a lot of people hear social norms, they're talking about, I think most of the things that we've mentioned, I think which are pretty day-to-day, but with the exception of kind of gender norms, racial norms, racism, misogyny, that kind of norm, which speaks to broader things. But when we look at, say, fairness, norms about what fairness is, there was, you quoted something in a paper, or maybe it was your line, but it was about like a lion, a wolf, a fox going for a hunt, right? And then, you can make the case that maybe fair is equally dividing up the provision if they all contribute equally. But you can also make the case that maybe the lion is larger, requires more energy, therefore they need more. You kind of have this, and I think that's relevant when we think about how we look at economies, healthcare. I think that's kind of the core thesis of, say, someone like Marx, when you have something like, from each according to their ability to each according to their need. That's actually not an equal division fairness. And so you have an argument that with all the other things that are there in his critique in Kapital, et cetera, you have things that are also challenges to the norms of our interpretation of how society ought to be governed. And I think that's what's particularly relevant to everyone when you're talking about the philosophy of norms or the cognitive science of norms. It's that it's not just how we relate to people on a day-to-day basis, which is what people normally think, but it's how your economy and how your society is structured.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And definitely, in the case of fairness, so I take it that your point is like, well, the thing that philosophy or cognitive science can contribute here is like we get an explanation of where some of these ideas come from and what sort of function they might play socially. And then from the sort of like normative or applied point of view of like changing society for the better or implementing good public policy, then that knowledge is going to be useful in terms of like, justifying departures from the sort of like received norm. But I also think that fairness itself is kind of like complicated, right? So some of the the studies that I spoke about in that paper, which are actually studies about the emergence of fair division specifically, they assume that fair division arises in situations where there's no asymmetries of power, no asymmetries of need, no asymmetries of skill. And then in those kinds of cases, like, of course, a norm of fair division is going to emerge. But maybe in other sorts of cases where there are asymmetries, then that sort of like social context is going to speak in favor of a different norm evolving. And it could be that the framework also explains why you get different notions of fairness depending on the context.
So when you're working on these projects now, kind of going forward, if you say a decade down the line, are there kind of like dream topics you have that you'd be working on?
Well, I sort of like in the terrain of dreams, let's put it
Yeah,
like that.
yeah.
I would really like to conduct some empirical studies about like this idea, this hypothesis that I formulated about teaching, because I do think that hypothesis has some empirical consequences. So I would love to either acquire the skills as a philosopher to be able to test that empirically, or collaborate with people who have the skills already. That would be nice. To conduct some experiments and test out that hypothesis. I think that would be a nice sort of thing to do. And in terms of coherence, I would really like to write a book on this, presenting a sort of unified picture of how to think about coherence when you bring in stuff about fragmentation and stuff about how to sort of like think about responsiveness to reasons and so on. So those are two things I would like to pursue in the future.
Cool. Well, you're in the right institution for that. I mean, in the cognitive science department, the two kind of founders of the department are the ones that defined like ostensive learning in children and across development in cognitive
amazing.
science. So they're like the two people, Gergely and Chibura, that you have to cite if you're working on learning and teaching.
Okay,
so
wow.
that's quite convenient. You just have to go up the
Amazing.
stairs and
That's easy enough.
That's really nice.
Great.
And yeah, so I guess finally, why are you doing what you're doing? What is the purpose of the topics that you've taken on? Why do you feel philosophy is the way, and further sort of empiricism? Why is it that you do what you do?
Oh, so is a question why philosophy?
No, kind of like why the topics? It can be
Why
the
the
methods as
specific
well.
topics?
Yeah.
Okay.
Why the topics? Why the methods? Maybe they inform each other? I'm not sure.
Yeah, that's a question I struggle with, whether they inform each other. I'm not sure about that yet. I would like to discover some sort of like connection. But why the topic? So I think I've always been fascinated by rationality in general. So, and in that sense, I'm not very different from a lot of philosophers who think that rationality is really what sets us apart from other sorts of like animals. And I just think like maybe both coherence and social norms kind of tap into very different but equally important aspects of our rationality. So go back to Aristotle. He both said that man is a rational animal and that man is a social animal, right? He has both of those like phrases. And I think I kind of want to understand, what does it mean to be rational? Important question, what does it mean to be coherent? And what does it mean to be social? Important question, what does it mean to follow social norms? So I just see it as really crucial to the sort of creatures that we are. And in that sense, like very interesting questions.
Yeah, awesome.
Cool.
Thank you so much.
Yeah,
thank you both for coming.
Thanks for having me. That was
Yeah,
fascinating.
it was great.
Great conversation.